On the eve of the biggest weekend in racing, Jimmie Johnson says he's open to doing the Indy 500 Coke 600 double one day. How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric. Welcome to Out of the Groove. Memorial Day weekend, always a fantastic weekend of racing across the world, but especially here in the United States with the Indy 500 and the Coke 600 running back to back. We're going to talk about what Jimmie Johnson said about running the two races, as well as what some other NASCAR stars said about the Indy 500 in just a moment. But first, with Memorial Day right around the corner, let's talk about a great veteran-owned business. Black Rifle Coffee is a veteran-owned business proudly serving great coffee and content to military veterans and first responders. They feature a wide variety of products, including whole bean and ground coffee, in addition to coffee rounds and ready-to-drink espresso beverages. If you head to blackriflecoffee.com, link down in the description, you can sign up for everything from single purchases to subscription offerings that deliver great coffee and great products directly to your door. You can also find their 4 varieties of ready-to-drink espresso beverages at retailers including Bass Pro Shops. Visit their website to find a retailer near you, blackriflecoffee.com, and help Black Rifle Coffee reach their goal of hiring 10,000 veterans. I know this is a NASCAR show, but we're going to talk a little Indianapolis 500 here. Before we get to that, yesterday, Shell Pennzoil announced a major extension and expansion with Team Penske. A lot of this expansion involves IndyCar. Of course, Roger Penske now owns the IndyCar Series and Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But on the NASCAR side of things, Shell Pennzoil has committed to being the primary sponsor for the 22 car for more than 30 plus races a year. That's good to hear, but what's interesting is that this deal did not explicitly include an extension for Joey Logano, whose current contract with Penske runs through the end of next season. That means he's still under contract for a year and a half. There is no imminent need to get a contract extension signed, but for you worried Logano fans out there, here's what Roger Penske said. "We have an agreement with Joey through 2023. Obviously, he and I have talked about extending it. We wanted to get the Shell contract done, which we signed this past week. He and I are in good conversation about him and expect to announce his extension here shortly." That's reported by Bob Pockrass, so Logano likely will stay with Team Penske beyond next year. But it was interesting to see this big Shell contract extension expansion announced and have Joey Logano not really be a part of it, at least not this initial announcement. So just wanted to clear that up. I think Logano will stay with Penske, but even if a contract extension isn't signed anytime soon, they've got like 18, 19 months to make something happen. Now, let's talk about the Indianapolis 500, the 106th running of the Indy 500. This is a NASCAR show primarily, so we're mainly going to talk about the NASCAR tie-ins to this year's race. We'll talk about Jimmie Johnson in just a moment. He had some interesting things to say during Indy 500 Media Day this week. But many NASCAR stars have been asked recently about whether they would consider running the Indianapolis 500. And I want to start with this quote from Kyle Larson. He's been asked a million times in the last couple years about whether he would run the Indy 500, and his answer has been pretty consistent that, yeah, he'd be open to it if the situation was right. But Bob Pockrass asked him an interesting question. Because his roots obviously are in dirt racing, Pockrass asked if Kyle Larson ever thought IndyCar racing or the Indy 500 was his career path. And Larson said, "Not even really. I think my goal and dream at the time was always to make it to NASCAR. Obviously, if an IndyCar or whatever the lower series R opportunities came first, I probably would have entertained it, maybe just because I thought that's what I would have had to have done." I thought that was an interesting response. Kyle Larson, as much as he loves his dirt racing and continues to go and race major events across the country and win major events, he won a World of Outlaws race like last week. His focus was always on NASCAR, on getting to the NASCAR Cup Series. I thought that was interesting. Now, Kyle Larson continues to reiterate that if an Indy 500 opportunity came up, if you had a chance to be competitive, if it made sense from a scheduling perspective, he would love to run the Indianapolis 500. And I think all of us race fans, NASCAR, IndyCar, dirt racing, would be better for it. I think we'd all have a ton of fun watching Kyle Larson make laps at 230 plus miles per hour. Now there's another Kyle in NASCAR who has long been rumored to be pursuing an Indy 500 opportunity. Kyle Busch was asked last week at Texas, and again this was asked by Bob Pockrass, if running the Indianapolis 500 was still on his radar.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly on my radar. The year that I had it sold and committed and sponsorship was there and everything like that, I got told no. And then I haven't necessarily tried to sell sponsorship since, but there was a easy verbal yes commitment, and things have changed obviously. So don't have that these days. But
some interesting tidbits there. NASCAR owners have long been strict about what other racing disciplines their drivers are allowed to participate in. Sometimes it's just schedule conflicts or maybe a sponsor conflict, but other times there's safety as a major concern. These team owners like Joe Gibbs and major sponsors like M&M's, for example, have invested millions into these drivers, these human persons. Anything that puts their safety at risk, that could potentially sideline them for a significant amount of time, hurts their business tremendously and hurts their investment. So I understand for the most part why many team owners have been protective of their drivers for the longest time. But Kyle Busch says there that he's still open to running the Indy 500, or running the Indy 500 is still on his radar. And I do think times have changed. Jimmie Johnson left NASCAR to go IndyCar racing, hasn't been very competitive on the road courses, but ran great at Texas a few months back, ran 6th on an oval there. Jimmie Johnson has said that he would not be racing the Indianapolis 500 if not for the introduction of the aero screen, the protective screen and kind of halo around the driver that has, I think, in many ways already paid dividends in the IndyCar series. A major safety feature that was introduced that ultimately convinced Jimmie Johnson to try oval racing. I think other drivers and maybe even some team owners are looking at that new safety feature, are looking at the aero screen, and maybe a bit more comfortable sending their superstar NASCAR drivers to the IndyCar series. Kyle Busch attempting the Indianapolis 500, I think is great for both series, so as a fan of American racing, broadly speaking, I would love to see that. It's great to see Jimmie Johnson running it this year in a competitive car. That's going to be a dramatic story to follow all Sunday afternoon. It already has been the whole month of May, but the more NASCAR stars we see attempt one of the biggest races in the world, the better, I'd say, from a fan's perspective. But let's move off hypotheticals and let's talk about something that's actually happening this Sunday. Jimmie Johnson, one of the greatest NASCAR drivers ever, depending on who you ask, he may be the greatest stock car racing driver in the history of the discipline. He will compete this Sunday in the 106th Indianapolis 500. And he was asked recently during Indy 500 Media Day if he would ever consider coming back to NASCAR to race the Coke 600 and the Indy 500 in the same day. Do the double, as it's known. He said, quote, "I'm open to it. I don't know if it would ever come together, but I'm certainly open to it. I always thought that the guys doing the double just did something special and unique, and I wanted to do that." Jimmie Johnson leaving the door open. Now, he has said in the last couple of years that he's open to coming back to NASCAR for a one-off here or there, if it's with a competitive team, if the schedule works out. I think a great driver like Jimmie Johnson is naturally intrigued by a new challenge. That's what's brought him over to IndyCar for this 2-year sabbatical he's been on. And I think the new challenge of the next gen, an all-new car that I don't believe he's raced in or made any laps into this point, I think would be a huge draw. That's a new challenge, and Jimmie Johnson does not seem to be afraid of a new challenge. And, with a team like Trackhouse introducing a third car for international racing superstars, I know Jimmie Johnson, technically an American racing driver, but they might make an exception and leave that seat open to him if he can pull sponsorship together. If he came back and ran the 600, say in a Trackhouse or equivalent car, I think he runs 20th. He probably spins out at some point getting used to the new feel, especially with so little practice or track time before the race these days. I don't think he'd be great, but he'd probably stay on the lead lap for a while. I think it'd be at least interesting to watch, and very few drivers have successfully done the double. It would be really cool to add Jimmie Johnson's name to that list. Obviously one of the greatest ever. It'd be cool to see him attempt one of the greatest feats in racing. Before we talk about the possibility of Jimmie doing the double next year or the year after, let's talk about this weekend for a second. One question that everyone's been throwing around the last few weeks is, can Jimmie Johnson realistically win the Indianapolis 500 in his first try? And I think this is just his second oval start in an open wheel car. The short answer to that question is yes, but let's not get crazy. Jimmie Johnson starts 12th in a Chip Ganassi car, a very competitive seat. His first oval start in an Indy car ever was just a couple months ago at Texas Motor Speedway, where I think he surprised himself and everyone by running a solid 6th. By far his best performance in the IndyCar series to date. Juan Pablo Montoya, obviously one of the all-time great race car drivers, said this week that he absolutely believes Jimmie Johnson could win the Indy 500. He's not one of the favorites. I wouldn't list him as one of the top 5 or even top 10 favorites to win this race, but without question, he has a chance. Here's my prediction. He starts 12th. I think he'll run inside the top 10 for a good portion of the race. He might even sneak up into the top 5 and maybe sniff the podium or maybe even the lead for a brief instant. But 200 laps around Indianapolis Motor Speedway is a lot. And we've already seen Jimmie Johnson be on the edge of control once this week. I'll be impressed if he finishes the race. I think he's going to be pushing really, really hard to be competitive, to race up in the top 5, top 10 with the big guns. I won't be shocked if he slips a little and ends up making a mistake. And at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, there is such a small margin for error. I'll be impressed if he finishes the race. I think if he finishes the race, he'll finish inside the top 10 and potentially, depending on how other things play out, how strategy plays out, what happens to some of the other front runners, he could be in contention for the win. But realistically, I think a top 10 should be the goal. I think anything worse than that, I think anything outside the top 10 will be a disappointment. We saw what he did at Texas. We've seen his practice speeds this month. If he ends up finishing like 15th, I think everyone will say, oh, okay, he did all right, but we won't be satisfied. That's what I mean. Anything worse than, I'd say, a top 10 will be a slight disappointment. I know that's a ton of pressure to put on a driver who's never run the Indianapolis 500 before, but I think Jimmie's ready for it. I think he's putting a lot of that pressure on himself. Think of it this way. I think this is the first IndyCar race so far that Jimmie Johnson expects to run well in. We'll see how he handles it. I think he'll do well, but I won't be shocked if he slips and makes a slight mistake that costs him an otherwise strong performance. That's my prediction. Share your thoughts down below. Do you think Jimmie Johnson has a realistic shot at winning the 106th Indianapolis 500? Leave your comments down below. And would you like to see Jimmie Johnson do the Indy 500 Coke 600 double? Schedules would have to align. He'd have to have a competitive NASCAR seat available. What team would you like to see him race for? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you, as always, to my remarkable Patreon supporters for supporting the show. We'll be back later this weekend. Gonna be a long, long day of racing on Sunday, but a great day, hopefully. Monaco, Indy 500, Coke 600, nearly 500,000 people will be sitting in grandstands watching American motorsports in person this weekend. That's awesome to see. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Have a fantastic Memorial Day weekend, y'all.